At the moment when we visit all coaches, we get no feedback that we're fetching new coaches, that we're loading coaches in the background. In addition, we don't have any error handling in place, and that's also not optimal. So it would be great if we could do both. Check the current loading status and also add error handling. And of course I want to do that in the components because that is where I want to update the UI eventually. But we're sending the HTTP request in the Vuex store, so that kind of clashes. Well, not necessarily, thankfully. Let's start with fetching coaches, because that is easiest to test for us here at the moment. We want to show a loading spinner whilst we're fetching coach data, so that we don't have this flickering whenever we reload the page. Hence, we first of all need a loading spinner. Now, I prepared a complete component for you, which you find attached. The base spinner zip file holds this base spinner view file, which you can copy into your UI components folder. The base spinner component in the end just renders a loading spinner on the screen. It's a bunch of markup and a bunch of CSS. And we can use this base spinner here to render it on the coaches list page whilst we're loading. Now, thankfully, as I said, we can find out if we're loading or not, even though the request is being sent with help of Vuex. Because when you dispatch an action, there is a nice feature which I haven't shown you before because we didn't really need it before. Dispatch can also return something to the component where you call it. And for example here, when we dispatch the load coaches action, since we use the async keyword here, it automatically returns a promise which will resolve once we're done with all these steps. And that's great because that means, since this promise is returned, that in coaches list, we can basically listen for this promise completion, and we know that when it is completed, we're not loading anymore. Because then we clearly got a response. Hence, we can add a new data property in the coaches list component next to active filters, and that's the isLoading property, which initially is false, let's say. And isLoading, this data property, should be set to true in the load coaches method when this method is executed. So here I then set this to true. Then we dispatch the request, we dispatch the action where the request is sent, and once this is done, once this promise returned by dispatch resolves, we know we no longer are loading. So since dispatch here returns a promise, we can also use async await here to wait for this promise to complete, and then set isLoading to false thereafter. So this will then be set to false once the request is done. And that will allow us to show a loading spinner. Maybe here, above the unordered list, we can add a div where we check with vif if we are loading, so that this is only added if we are loading. And then I render my base spinner here, this loading spinner component I just gave you. We now just have to register this in main.js. So here in main.js, we import the base spinner from /components UI base spinner.view and register it as a global component with app component pointing at base spinner. So now the base spinner is available, and in coaches list we are rendering it here if we are loading. Now that also means I want to adjust my has coaches computed property here a bit, because this list should of course only be rendered if we have coaches and we're not loading at the moment, so that it disappears if we are loading. So in the has coaches computed property, we should adjust this a little bit and not just check this here, but also check that we're not loading at the moment. So add this to the computed property so that if we are loading, we never show the list. Okay, so with that, if I save this, now we see that loading spinner. Now it's only there briefly because this is all super quick, but hey, at least we see it briefly. We also briefly see no coaches found because we show this whenever the list is not rendered. And at the moment, this of course means that, well, it's always rendered whilst we're loading. So the list is not rendered then, but this is then always rendered. But we can fix this by turning this from VIF to VElseIf, so that we either are loading and showing the loading spinner, or we have coaches and show those, or we have none and show this text. And then we only have the spinner here. Now we also see the register as coach button flickering. Of course, that button also shouldn't show up if we're loading. So here I want to check not just if we're not a coach, but also we're not loading. Only then this should show up. If we are loading, it should not show up. So if I reload, this button is not flickering. Okay, perfect. So now we got this loading spinner here. When I refresh, we also see it. Now what about error handling? At the moment, if things go wrong, for example, if I introduce a deliberate error here by going to the load coaches action and removing the N at the end, if we get an error, we just see an infinite loading spinner and we see the error here. But of course, our users don't have the developer tools open typically. So we want to show an error message here to the user as well in that case. So therefore, error handling is what I want to implement next.